Cool, so, hello. So, this is me. If you still like Twitter, that's my Twitters, but you might do better to go with LinkedIn. I'm not on Threads yet, or whatever the new Facebook thing that steals all your data and privacy and all that stuff is. I work for a company called Bloom & Wild. So, we are Europe's leading online flower delivery company. So, we're a 3-brand company in 8 different countries, and I do big engineering there, so I run our engineering team. We've got a pretty big 60 people technology team. Come on in, take a seat. There's a big gap in the middle. And if you remember nothing from this talk whatsoever, if you love flowers, and you're going to love flowers by the end of this talk, that's a 15% off discount code. So come buy our lovely flowers and use the technology behind it. So I'm here to talk to you about support. I want to get a couple of things out of the way first. So when I say support, I do not mean IT support. I don't mean have you turned it off and back on again sort of support. I don't really mean support in the kind of wider sense of how do we support each other as humans. I don't mean support as in how do you support maybe a football team. As an aside, this is the mighty Woking FC winning promotion a few seasons ago to the nationwide conference again. They're my team, taken from a position of safety, not on the pitch. No, what I'm here to talk to you about is I'm here to talk to you about a journey, ultimately. A journey we've taken at Bloom & Wild from when we were a very, very small startup to where we are today. So you're working in an engineering team, you're working in a squad, you're designing, you're writing, you're testing, you're deploying your code. You should be operating it, you should be monitoring it, and then you should be supporting it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So hopefully you do all of this in the same team, right? Some nods. I'll take that as a good thing. So this is about how we've built out and some of the journey we've been through to support both internal users of our platform, so internal users of our CRM, our fulfillment platforms, and ultimately the technology that powers business, and our customers. So lovely people like yourselves who come along and buy our flowers. Now, I'm not going to say about whether you should do it, how you should do it, whether it's a good idea. People who know far more about it than me have done that already. Some of them have even done it at this conference. So if you want to know about things like you build it, run it, and whether it's a good idea, go and bug Steve, the tall Cornish guy. He will help you. But what I am here to do is to tell you about a journey, tell you a little bit of a story about how we've gone from very, very small to very big. A lot of what this stuff is about how do you go from centralised operations teams to start spreading that responsibility more widely. We've kind of had the opposite problem. So we've had the problem of it was always the responsibility of a single team. How can we avoid building an ops team? But ultimately, at its heart, this is a story about how the clever people like this enable lovely people like this to receive beautiful flowers like that. And it's a little bit of a story about this guy, and we will talk about him later. So what I thought is, I come to tech conferences a lot, and I talk about flowers, and I thought this is a wonderful opportunity through this and how we build flowers to also teach you folks a little bit about flowers. So there's a little bit of a quiz as we go through this as well, and I'm going to test your flower knowledge. So we'll start with something quite easy. What's that?
Flower.
Brilliant. The flower has a specific name, and that specific name is the daisy. It is available in this beautiful bouquet from Bloom & Wild. You could use your 15% discount. But no, daisy, it's a small flower. Bloom & Wild, we started as a very small company. This is our first website 13-ish years ago. So, looks pretty nice, doesn't it? Maybe not. And when you're at this sort of scale as a startup, you're small. So you have a small number of engineers. This was our engineering team at that stage. So very small company, 30 odd people. little engineering team. And when you're in this sort of mode, what you're really there to do, you're there to find market fit, you're there to be flexible, you're there to ship your code, you're there to learn, you course correct, you repeat. And it's kind of almost like the making mistakes phase, effectively, and how quickly you can learn from those mistakes is the most important thing. And support at this sort of stage of a company is quite easy, because you're very, very small. You're probably co-located. So support becomes something like this. So support just becomes, you could shout over the cubicle wall, or the virtual cubicle wall, if that's your thing. And because the team's really small, it's highly likely that that information flow about what's not working is very, very short. So, for example, your head of customer service is quite likely to be sat right next to you. They may be the only person doing customer service, but hey, startups love overblown job titles, don't they? And so if something's wrong, someone's going to tell you. And if you've got a small team, your team is probably going to mob on that problem, fix that particular problem, because in all its chances, that problem is probably quite a big one, because you move fast and break a lot of stuff when you're trying to find market fit. So support in this model becomes really quite easy. And this kind of brings us to our kind of first learning, which is when you're small, you don't need much. And more specifically, there's a trap here, which is you could try, and it's really tempting, because small startups are really chaotic, and people thrive on that chaos. It's really easy to try and introduce process here too early. So it's really easy to try and come in and say, we need this entire really, really tight support process. That would be a mistake at this sort of phase. That's bureaucracy, you'll be seen as a blocker. You come in and do that as a leader, you will not be successful. So first learning, you don't need much when you start, don't do much when you start. Focus on building relationships, because also, using my example of the head of customer service there, people who are in those sorts of roles at the beginning of a startup tend to then take the more senior roles as it scales. So it's about relationship building. So let's move on. So let's say in your gardening journey, you've moved on from your windowsill, and you've maybe got a few pots on your patio, maybe you're growing some herbs or a chili plant or something like that. This is a flower. Does anybody want to hesitate to guess at what flower this is?
Iris?
To stop. As it happened. Available in this beautiful bouquet. So, Blue and Wild is now on our journey. We've started scaling, so we've found market fit. We've got a really compelling proposition in the UK, and we've started to then think about international expansion. So we've moved on, we moved into Germany, we moved into France. And this, as a project for our technology team, was a pretty difficult one. Suddenly you're having to worry about localization, you're having to worry about different languages, you're having to worry about different currencies, you're having to worry about effectively more than one website, if you want to look at it in very, very simplistic terms. And you're having to worry about that localization trickling all the way through your platform. So, for example, if you're dispatching and fulfilling flowers, you would not fulfill your flowers in Germany from your warehouse in the UK. Because if you do that, people are going to be opening boxes of really quite dead-looking flowers. So you need to make sure that the time between when you ship and when you get your box is as short as possible. And so, lots and lots of extra challenges here. And this project, to do this, the quality initially wasn't great. And consequently, the load on support started to increase. Now, remember I said there wasn't really any process here. There was no process. Process turned into a single Slack channel to do support, which got rapidly exceptionally chaotic because there was no prioritization mechanism. There was this and this and this. There was a lot of highest paid person's opinion counting on what gets fixed. This is the stage to build that trust and build that quality and start to think about how do you put a bit of process in place? How do you stop people slacking their favourite engineer to try and get their problem fixed? Which, if you're trying to lead a team like that, it's impossible because you've got no idea what anyone's working on. And this is where this little guy comes in. So this is supporty. So here's our little Slack bot that manages, and to this day still manages, our internal support process. And he helps to bring order, should I say, to the chaos. So the supporty is very, very simple. Supporty is a little TypeScript Slack bot. And what supporty does, basically, is supporty fires up this nice little entry box. People put in what their problem is. They give it a priority. They tell us how important they think it is to them. We pin our issues to a Slack channel, and we push data into a data warehouse. Seems really, really simple, but actually, at this sort of stage, when you're scaling, a bit of a game changer. So our Slack channel, as an example, I'm going to pop that in, looks a little bit like this. So you've got pinned issues, you've got priorities for issues, you've got a simple view, therefore, of what your latest status is. So for me, I can look at this and say, okay, what's important, what's not important, how many issues have we got open? You've got clarity on who owns these. There's a bit of some Slack groups behind the scenes on these that enable us to assign them to individual squads and see which squad is owning them. There's a prioritization mechanism, and there's a huge data set to learn from, and that will become really important. I'll talk about that later. But these priorities become super important, because once you establish a clear prioritization mechanism with others in business, then you set clearer expectations. And so, prioritization mechanisms are, it's quite simple stuff once you do it. So, the sky's falling in, the website's going down, that's probably the highest priority, particularly if you're an e-commerce company. If you can't take orders and you can't ship those orders, you've got a problem. But equally, there are some things that are either less time critical or less important, but are still important to consider being fixed. Or for example, you might have something cosmetic, something may not look right, but it may be okay, and this particularly when we think about things like translations, it may be a correct translation, but it may not be grammatically perfect, then we can live with that. Maybe we can live with that for more than 24 hours. So clear priorities become really, really important. So this brings us kind of to our second learning, which is things will become more complex as your startup becomes more mature. There comes a point to bring a bit of order to the chaos. Tooling is a good thing to bring order to the chaos. You could buy your tools. There's lots of tools, PagerDuty, Optogenie, lots of other tools. They're not very cheap. Sometimes building your own thing works. And make sure you can get stats from those tools. So make sure you're generating data. Bring some order to the chaos. But you put a tool in place, and then people hide behind the tool, don't they? Don't hide behind the tool. Hiding behind the tool is a very bad thing and a very easy thing to do as soon as you do this. So what we found has been really useful has just been to put some simple, clear expectations in place for both ourselves and our users on the use of the tool. So these are our really simple, clear expectations. So we love it when people flag issues to us. We'd much rather people flagged issues to us than sat on them and didn't think they were important or were somehow scared of using a process. But we have to remember, just like the prime directive, people are trying to do the best under the circumstances with the information that they have. So there are humans on either side of this process. We like more detail, we like quick responses. Quick responses get things fixed quicker. Please stop slacking your favourite developer. It won't get something fixed quicker. Okay, so let's move on. Let's say in your gardening journey you've moved on and you've got a bit into this gardening. So maybe you like in lockdown, everyone was building raised beds and garden bars and stuff like that. Maybe you built yourself a nice raised bed. Correct. That's an Alstroemeria. Available in this beautiful video. Okay, so you've scaled up, you've got your tools, you've put a process in place. It's beginning to generate some data. This is important. So here's an example of an issue that we had, /caused. So we started to get response from our customer service team that our apps weren't working, and they weren't working in the US. Now, the US isn't a huge market for us. We don't ship to the US, but people often like to use our services from other countries to ship flowers to people in, say, the UK, for example. So we had actually put some a small resolution in place to deal with a security issue, and that had inadvertently started blocking a group of users within the US who were using our iOS app. Now, raised as a P2, it had 143 replies on the Slack thread in the support piece from 12 different people, and took about 5 hours to identify and resolve. Now, I probably don't have to say that's quite a lot of money being spent on that. Now, there's a good reason to do it. So here's a piece of feedback we got in the App Store. Saying, oh, there was a problem, they fixed it, and 1 star to 5 star. Yay! But this is still a lot of money. And you could sleepwalk yourself into situations where you're spending huge amounts of time and money on your support process without realizing it. And the reason you're not going to realize it is because you don't have the data, and you don't have the observability effectively on your process in place. So for example, we look at things like, obviously, simple metrics. How long, on average, do we have our different priority of requests open? This sort of stuff's quite useful. But what gets really useful, particularly if you're an engineering leader, is what's actually the taxonomy of those requests. So what you can see here is, and I've removed the squad names to preserve anonymity, how many of the requests that we get actually result in changes to the code. So ultimately, how many requests do we get that you could class as bugs? There was something wrong and we needed to fix it. Now, what you can see from here is, one squad, clearly there's something else going on. Now, what that something else is going on is they actually own the technology and the product domain, which is extremely difficult to use, extremely hard to set up, and lacks validation. And therefore, consequently, it's very easy for users of that part of our system to get into a bit of a pickle and set something up that doesn't work for them, and only really find out when they don't get the outcome in production that they expect. And so having a stat like this is very useful when we're thinking about, should we be investing more in simplification of that part of the system? Should we be making it easier for the internal users? We wouldn't have this insight if we weren't collecting this sort of stat. What you could also do then is you could also start to put a cost on this sort of stuff. And that's also a really useful mechanism if you're trying to lobby for change. So I can look at what's the cost of that squad. They're spending this much time answering queries and requests. So here's good justification on why perhaps we should be investing more of that money and getting more of that return. So stuff like this should be they should be first level citizens. It should be first level citizens, just like you look at, I don't know, the observability of your DB, for example. And making this sort of stuff visible and socializing this is really important. It's really tempting not to, because you think, oh, this paints a bit of a bad picture. This makes it look like we've got quality problems, or oh my God, we're spending so much time on support. But the reality is, by doing this sort of stuff, what you're actually doing is starting a conversation about how can we make the system better and where. Now, don't do that. This becomes really useful because inevitably, as an engineering leader, you will be asked at some point, why is your team got so slow? Particularly if you work in a startup, because it will feel like starting to slow down. Support load is often one of those things that starts to slow down. I'm not going to say more about it. There's a link to a presentation by somebody with a great name from last year, but this gives a little bit of some hints and tips on how you can deal with that sort of situation. One other metric, this is one of the DORA metrics that can be useful in this sort of situation when you have a data set, is to look at change failure rate, which is i.e., how often when you push something into production does it cause an incident? So if you can measure your number of deploys, for example, so if you can measure your deploys, and you can measure the deploys of your different apps, and you can measure what you class to be an incident, and you can tie those two pieces together, you can measure your change failure rate. And then you can also then look at where you might want to make changes further upstream. So maybe this could point to a problem in your process. Maybe it could point to a gap in a particular squad, for example. Maybe it could point to over complexity of a particular app or code base that belongs in the technology domain of a particular squad. So again, it's giving you observability on what's going wrong and where you can actually prevent that, rather than just saying, oh my god, we've got a support problem. So this is the third learning. So collect data as early as you possibly can, because it's very impactful. You will be able to learn from it. You can do really useful things with it. Do not be afraid of collecting that data, and do not be afraid of surfacing that data. Okay, so we're in your our growing journey where you love this plant and flower growing thing. You built yourself a greenhouse. Maybe you feel like you're retired or something, I don't know. Correct. Available in this book. Right, let's move on. So, what I've been describing to you so far has been what happens in hours. So in hours for Bloom and Wild basically means from 9 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock in the evening between Monday and Friday. So by this stage in our journey, we had a nice, mature, data-driven process in hours. Now, kind of just like Cinderella, but maybe a little bit earlier. It wasn't kind of when the sun went down, it was at 6 o'clock. This all changed. So, if an incident came in after 6 o'clock, what would usually happen is either I'd be sitting down having my tea, or maybe watching some TV, or lying in bed, and then I get a WhatsApp, normally from our CEO or COO, saying, oh my god, there's a problem. And then I would be like, ah. Now, what I would then be doing is effectively trying to find an engineer to fix that particular problem, which, if you're trying to do it at like 11 or 12 o'clock at night, is interesting. Makes you definitely feel like that. It makes the engineer feel like that. And what it was time to do here was look and use the data that I'd collected, the data on areas of the system's focus on, the data on what it was costing us and what these incidents were costing us, to put in a process that was out of hours as well as in hours. And this is really important because people don't stop buying flowers at 6 o'clock in the evening. And people buy flowers at really weird times. Really odd. The number of people buying flowers at 4 o'clock in the morning, significantly higher than you should be. And so this was the point. We put paid out of hours in. And I really believe that paid out of hours support is absolutely fundamental. It's very important. People do not focus on this enough. They do not focus on it early enough. And doing so is fair, ultimately. It's not fair to put people under the pressure of not knowing whether their phone is going to ring or they're going to get a WhatsApp at 11 o'clock at night. It sets clear expectations. Frankly, it's good for mental health. It's not just the mental health of like me as the person who has to chase around and try and find an engineer at 11 o'clock at night, but more importantly, the engineers. Because if you know you're on out-of-hours support, you can tailor your life and your expectations to that fact. So we have some kind of clear expectations if you're on out-of-hours support. You are not, for example, dressed as a zombie and drunk. I suspect he's also not 15 minutes away from workable Wi-Fi with a laptop. Just a guess. But it sets that clear expectation. But what it also avoids is it avoids people like me picking on my favourite engineer that I know is able to solve the problem, and not doing that in a fair way. So we have a small paid out-of-hours support team of 5 people, and they know when they opt in, and they know that on a week-by-week basis, if the phone rings, we use Ops Genie to run our process here. When the phone rings and it's the automated voice from America, that A, there's an issue, and B, it's only them. So they're almost effectively expecting it. And they're getting compensated for it. And the reality is, in the grand scheme of things, it's not actually that expensive. If you think about the implications of, for example, for an e-commerce company, of being down for 3 or 4 hours, versus the amount over the course of a year you'll pay folks to be on support, it's not that expensive. But yet, so many companies just rely on goodwill, and I don't think that's fair. Now, so we roll out our process. This is Bernat, one of our senior lead platform engineer, and Bernat is on the out-of-hours process, and we get an incident. This is real, by the way. I haven't made this up. I've just blurred. I've boxed out the name of the person just to preserve anonymity. So Bernat is asleep. Somebody raises a major incident. Bernat's phone rings. So this is one way in which major incidents come in. We also have a bunch of our alerting plumbed into our incident process as well, so some alerts are automatic. Bernat's phone rings. So Bernat wakes up, Bernat gets out of bed, Bernat turns on his computer, Bernat looks at the out-of-hours request in a bit more detail. The nature of the out-of-hours request is in the title of the out-of-hours request, if you can see it from the back. Bernat goes back to sleep. I know what you're wondering. Was it Lionel Richie? We still don't know. So out of hours is good. You sometimes have to train your users a little bit. So this is my 4th learning. So make it easier, make it fairer, make out of hours work, make it work for everybody. Okay, so you've got your greenhouse. You're going to go for a whole garden of flowers. What's this? It is a peony. And my clicker is now not going to allow me to tell you it's a peony for some obscure reason. Ooh, what's going on here? There we go. It's Peony! In this bouquet. Now, the astute amongst you will have noticed I talked about support, and I called this doing the gardening at Bloom Wild. So support isn't just about user requests. Support is also about how you support your systems, and particularly when you go from startup to scale up, how you support all of those activities that you need to keep systems healthy and keep systems stable. So it's very, very easy when you're very, very small, because when you're very, very small, there's a very, very small number of people that are involved. And so when you've got a small number of people involved, these things just kind of happen almost automatically. So engineers care about the code base. If there's only 4 of them, they'll keep things like frameworks and dependencies up to date. They'll make sure that all the tests aren't going super flaky. And they'll focus on ultimately making the support level, that gardening, as we call it, just an everyday task. Now, that's great. But then we start to get bigger, and when you start to get bigger, what you find is that sort of breaks, because suddenly you've got more people, and if everybody's supposed to care about everything, that means basically nobody cares about most things, and things start to drop, or you start to put your emphasis and your expectations too much on 1 or 2 people that really, really care. And again, like out of hours, that's not fair. So we introduced a role called gardener. And what the gardener does for us, as well as making a nice little Death Star, is they were focused on ultimately, on a rotating basis for each of our code bases, doing the gardening, keeping things looking effectively nice, keeping your garden up to date. So doing things like monitoring and fixing some of those kind of longer running production problems, fixing things like our staging environments, updating frameworks, dependencies, and being the person expected on a week-by-week basis to be looking at this sort of stuff. And what that does is it shares that responsibility around, but it does it in a fair, shared, expected way. And this also had some other advantages. So it has some advantages. So if you're running a squad or you're running multiple squads, it made it a lot easier for you to manage your capacity, for example, because you knew that week that engineer was assigned to gardening tasks. They were not assigned to whatever was on your backlog. So it made it easier from that perspective. It also enabled engineers to get a little bit more upskilled in other areas of code base. They might be fixing problems that were not in their default domain, but they also weren't doing it under, I guess, delivery pressure. So they were doing it for gardening pieces. And like any of you that are gardeners, you know that mostly you don't have to do the gardening right now. You could, I don't know, go and trim that bush or that tree in a week's time, and it will make a huge amount of difference. But what it was doing was making a shared practice very clearly open. So this brings me to my fifth learning, which is supporting your systems is not the same as supporting your users. So if you can move yourself to a situation where you've got shared ownership or shared problems with single ownership, that can really, really help you. Particularly if, like us, you maybe have your systems backed with monoliths. So we've got a Ruby on Rails monolith in our back end. That means a lot of our ownership is naturally shared. Okay, so we are almost at the end of our gardening journey. Let's say you absolutely love this. You've got yourself an allotment. As an aside, I had an allotment for a while. It took me 6 years to get the allotment, 5 years of which I tended the website for the Allotment Association. In those 5 years, the Allotment Association owned no allotments. It's like an allotment lobbying website. It's brilliant. So, last one. This is difficult. What's this? This is Craspedia globosa. This is my favourite flower in the whole world. Let me explain to you why it's my favourite flower in the whole world. It's my favourite flower in the whole world because it looks like the microphone that Terry Woburn used to use on Planet Tank in the 1970s. That's the same thing, but not yellow. Right, so this is Bloom and Wild now. So this is our team now. We're significantly larger than we were, for example, pre-pandemic. We have 6 squads. We have supporting teams underneath them. Those squads own distinct product and technology domains. In some cases, they own their own applications, or they own a much more clearly defined area of our Ruby on Rails monolith. So there's more autonomy, there's more independence in this particular model. And what we found moving to this model is a lot of what I've told you, particularly about the gardener, starts to break down. And it starts to break down for these reasons. Because the cognitive load as an engineer on a system which 60 people are working on, which is powering a business across 8 countries and 3 different brands, is very, very different from the cognitive load on an engineer when you're powering 1 brand in 1 country. And so things start to break down a little bit. The gardener starts to break down as a concept, because if you're an engineer in 1 squad and you're dealing with issues as the gardener in a squad, let's say for example you're in an acquisition discovery squad, so you're all about how do we acquire customers and get them onto the website, and suddenly you're having to worry about problems in fulfillment squad, which is how do we produce your bouquet and ship your bouquet. That's very hard, and asking you in a week to understand and be impactful in that area of the code base isn't really worth it. So we start to find the gardener stops working, because the gardener is very focused on these weekly fixes, these pieces of the code base, and we've got longer term, bigger issues to solve. Equally, we find this responsibility piece isn't anchored in the right place. And also, frankly, at that sort of scale, we find it harder to explain the gardener and why the gardener is important. And so what starts to happen in the squads is the gardener's capacity starts to get borrowed for something that's more important. And it gets borrowed for something that's more important because the leaders of those squads are empowered to deliver those things within their domain that they understand that are important. and the gardener is working on something in a completely different domain they don't understand. So it's quite natural to want to get your stuff done. So what do? Just like an allotment, where you've got lots of individual gardeners all tending their own plots, but tied together in a community, normally an allotment association, we've taken the gardener role and we've broadened that out. So that is now a squad-based role on the same weekly cadence to make the management of capacity easier, but focused only on the technology domain owned by the particular squad. And then all those gardeners are all tied together in a community of practice. And so a community of practice for each of our code bases. What this means is, it means we can keep the accountability and the ownership within each individual squad for its technology and product domain, but we're still getting things updated, we're still getting dependencies dealt with, we're still getting frameworks and language versions upgraded, we're still getting things like tests fixed and environments working. But what this does is it anchors that craft and that capability in the right place, rather than trying to make everything shared responsibility. Shared responsibilities work well when you're small, they don't work well when you scale. Now, we could have done something different. So, we could have built a team of gardeners. And this is to the point of trying not to build an ops team. We could have built a team of gardeners. We could have said, okay, here's a team, here's all your responsibilities, you're in this team, you can leave this team at some point, and some companies do this. Now, it's easy to do. I think it would be a horrible, horrible team to be in. Please sit here and upgrade these dependencies, fix these tests, sort these things out. It's also, from my perspective, really hard to justify the value that that team brings. And it's very, very hard to justify how to connect the value of that team to a business outcome. So you might be, if you're on this journey, you might want to do something like this. I recommend thinking very hard before you decide to do this. This isn't promoting accountability and ownership. So this is the last learning, which is make autonomy and ownership your goal. Because if you do that, and you do that across everything you do, whether it's your gardening, or whether it's if you're building, or dare I say it, planting something new, then you're consistent and you're anchoring ownership in the right place. So obviously you're thinking, I've just told you all about that, it's all good, this is a conference presentation, people stand up and they say, yeah, we did this and it was all perfect. There's always a new gardening year, isn't there? So, as I mentioned, we have a shared monolith. That with a shared monolith comes some natural constraints. So we are doing a lot of work at the moment to make that internal ownership of that monolith easier, make breaking that monolith up easier, so we can really anchor that ownership and that responsibility. What I've told you here around the team of gardeners is it's an ongoing journey. We are close to the beginning of it, but we're making progress. Now, in case you were wondering, in my defence, this was no mow May, which is why the grass is taller than a football. Okay, so just to sum up, if you want to build it, you want to support it. You want to set your clear expectations. You want to do this from the start, clear expectations on both sides, both your users and your engineers. You'll need process for this, you'll need data for this, but you don't want to do it too early. Introduce it at the right time. Make sure you have that data, make sure you're using that data and you're learning from that data. It's like, it's like gold dust. It's so important, it's so useful. You can have such impactful conversations around where you invest your time and your money as a company. Please pay for on-call, and please do it before you think you should do it, and please don't put off that hard conversation with your CEO about on-call. It's really important for the mental health of your teams. And ultimately, make ownership, make that autonomy your goal. That's ultimately what helps teams to run successfully. And that's ultimately what's helped us do the gardening at Bloomwell. Thank you. And we have a little bit of time for questions. Anyone got one?
earlier on you were talking about how if people are poking their favourite developer to get stuff fixed, they won't get it fixed any quicker, and they should use the process in place. I work with a lot of people pleasers, and they love people coming to them with their problems and solving them themselves personally. What advice would you give for working with a lot of people pleasers like that and kind of following the team process of fixing things?
there's two things. So I think I guess that there's influencing the people to stop them, or effectively the customer in that relationship to stop them doing it. To be honest, otherwise I think make it harder for the people, the person pleaser, or more specifically, make them get their dopamine hit from something that's on the backlog. Because I think there's a lot of that. I've had it in engineers exactly.
So like punish them for fixing people's stuff?
No, don't punish them for fixing people's stuff, but give them something. Make sure they have enough work off the backlog, and that it's got a mixture of feedback loops. Because often people pleasers appreciate short feedback loops. And I think that's the thing. You get that dopamine hit from someone came to me with a problem. I solved their problem. There are other ways to get that dopamine hit that isn't effectively doing something you're not quite sure what's going on. Where's a need you're not sure what's going on.
Thank you.
Come on over here.
Right at the back.
Get some cardio as well.
I'm going to come over here. I set up to stand over here and then I never did.
I was fascinated by your, the importance of tooling in your processes. Did you build anything you should have bought, and did you buy anything you should have built?
Yeah, I think we're beginning to outgrow our homegrown supporty Slackbot. I think it's been extremely useful for us. It comes with obviously a small engineering overhead. I wouldn't have bought something like OpsGenie or PagerDuty or something at that stage. I think that would have been overkill. We bought OpsGenie mainly to power our out-of-hours process, and it's mainly for that automated, well, two things: the automated waking up of engineers or me, and the fact that we can plumb it automatically into a lot of our monitoring and observability. So where we really trust some of our monitoring, then we will have that in OpsGenie and the engineer automatically. Whereas if we tried to build that ourselves, I think, well, it's unnecessary. It's a hygiene thing for tooling like that. So why reinvent the wheel and carry that ongoing maintenance overhead within your own team?
One more question? Anyone?
One at the front?
Yep.
On the Gardener, what I've seen is you often end up without any system. There's often a self-elected Gardener in the team. I put my hand up, I often do that myself. And you mentioned, of course, there's the learning, getting to know it, having everyone with the skills. Have you found any other advantages to having the role move around and to get everyone to have a go, not just the person who loves doing it?
Yeah, I think it helps spread the knowledge. It also helps give the opportunities, I think, because some of those things around, I mean, as an example, if we've got an engineer and we can give them, I don't know, a Rails upgrade, so upgrade the framework we use for a Ruby on Rails application, that can be quite a big project and something they can really start to own and lead. So it opens up career opportunities as well. But I think in a lot of cases, it's very easy to get, particularly if you know you're a little bit of a monolith, to just be head down, really narrow focus, and therefore consequently it's about the learning opportunity, but I say that in inverted commas because some people want that learning opportunity, some people, I guess, it has to be sold to them a little bit more. But again, I guess to the question from over here earlier, is it does give that kind of dopamine hit back of, I've solved this thing for my community. So we have internal community practice, for example, for our Ruby community. And if you've, as a gardener, solved something for the good of the Ruby community, you're a hero. And so that can be really, really useful for kind of establishing and maintaining almost like status within that group as well.
Right, that's it. Thanks very much, Steve.